The sound of her sigh cut deeper than any insult ever could, because it wasn't angry or dramatic. It was tired and dismissive, like I had asked her to take out the trash instead of reaching for my own wife in our own bed. She rolled onto her side without even looking at me and said, "I told you I'm exhausted. I have a meeting in the morning. Can we not do this tonight?" And I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling like a stranger who had overstayed his welcome instead of the man who had paid half the mortgage for the last 8 years. It wasn't just that she said no, because I understand that no one owes anyone intimacy, but it was the way she said it, like the idea of me wanting her was some inconvenience she had to manage rather than something that once made her smile and pull me closer. This had been happening for months, the slow erosion of something that used to feel effortless, and every time I tried to bring it up, she would brush it aside with explanations about stress at work, headaches, hormonal changes, anything that sounded reasonable enough to make me question my own frustration. I would tell myself to be patient, to be supportive, to not turn into one of those bitter husbands who keeps score, but patience starts to rot when it's never acknowledged, and I could feel something inside me hardening in ways I didn't like. That night I finally rolled away first, my pride too bruised to even pretend I was fine, and I got out of bed because lying there next to her felt lonelier than sleeping on the couch. The hallway light was dim, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, and I stood there for a second just breathing, trying to calm the mix of humiliation and anger swirling in my chest. That was when I heard the soft click of a door behind me, and I turned to see her sister leaning against the wall, barefoot, wearing one of my wife's oversized shirts that fell just far enough to make me look away out of reflex. She had been staying with us for 3 weeks after her own breakup, and until that moment she had been nothing more than background noise in our strained marriage, someone I tried to be polite to while navigating my own disappointment. She studied my face like she had been waiting for this exact expression, and then she stepped closer and said quietly, "She turned you down again, didn't she?" And there was something in her tone that wasn't pity, but recognition, like she understood a language my wife had forgotten. I forced a tight smile and told her it wasn't her business, that it was just a long day, that everything was fine. But she didn't move away. Instead, she closed the distance between us, just enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin, and she said, almost in a whisper, "Maybe I won't." For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard her, because there is a line you assume people won't cross, especially family, especially under your own roof. And my brain scrambled to reinterpret her words into something harmless. I asked her what she meant, trying to keep my voice steady, and she held my gaze in a way that made my pulse thud in my ears. She said, "I mean, maybe someone in this house still notices you. Maybe someone still thinks you're worth wanting, and maybe you don't have to keep begging for crumbs." The air shifted in a way that felt almost physical, like the hallway had shrunk around us, and I felt both flattered and disgusted at the same time. I told her she shouldn't say things like that she was upset about her own breakup and projecting, that she was staying in our home and needed to respect boundaries, and she listened without interrupting, but there was a small smile tugging at her mouth that unsettled me. She stepped even closer, close enough that I could smell her shampoo, and said, "I see the way she talks to you, like you're an obligation, and I also see the way you still look at her like she's the only woman in the room. And it's honestly painful to watch because you deserve someone who doesn't treat you like a chore." My heart pounded so loudly I was sure she could hear it, and I hated that part of me wanted to believe her. Nothing physical happened that night, but something shifted that couldn't be undone. I walked past her and went downstairs, telling myself I was stronger than temptation, that I was just hurt and vulnerable, and that she was exploiting that. But even as I sat on the couch staring at the dark TV screen, her words replayed in my mind with dangerous clarity. It had been so long since anyone had spoken about me like I was still desirable, still worth pursuing, and that realization hurt more than the rejection upstairs. When she eventually came down to get a glass of water and lingered in the doorway watching me, there was an unspoken tension hanging between us that felt electric and wrong, And I knew in that moment that my marriage was standing on something far more fragile than I had been willing to admit. I wish I could say I shut it down immediately and demanded she leave the next day, but the truth is I didn't, because a part of me was starving, and when someone offers you attention after months of drought, even poisoned water looks tempting. I told myself I would keep my distance, that I would focus on fixing things with my wife, that this was just a strange late-night moment fueled by hurt pride, but as I lay awake on the couch staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of her sister standing in that hallway saying, "Maybe I won't," like it was both a promise and a challenge. I had no idea then that those 3 words were the first move in a game I didn't even realize I was being invited to play. By morning, I had convinced myself the hallway moment was a weird, one-off lapse in judgment, the kind of thing that only happens when a marriage is running on fumes and everyone in the house is tired and oversharing. But she didn't let it fade into the background the way awkward moments usually do, because she started orbiting me with a patience that felt calculated. It was little things at first, the kind you could dismiss if you wanted to keep your sanity intact, like how she always seemed to be in the kitchen when I came in for coffee, leaning against the counter in a way that made the room feel smaller, asking questions that sounded harmless but landed like fingers on a bruise. She would say, "Did you sleep at all? Because you looked like you were carrying something heavy last night." And when I'd shrug and say it was fine, she'd tilt her head like she didn't believe me and answer with something that kept the door open. "It doesn't look fine. It looks like you're trying to be invisible in your own house." She started doing this thing where she'd reach past me for a mug or a plate, and her hand would brush my wrist. Not a clumsy accident, but a slow, deliberate contact that lingered just long enough to make my skin remember it, and I hated how quickly my body reacted to being noticed, because it felt like betrayal, even though nothing had technically happened. When my wife was around, her sister became sweetness and courtesy, offering to help with laundry, complimenting her haircut, laughing at her jokes, and the contrast between that performance and the way she looked at me when my wife's back was turned made my stomach twist with a kind of dread that was also, if I'm being honest, a kind of heat I hadn't felt in too long. The worst part was how she framed it like she was doing me a favor by telling the truth, because she'd catch me alone and say, "I'm not trying to start anything. I'm just saying I see you, and I don't think you deserve to be treated like you're asking for too much when you're asking for basic affection." And I would try to shut it down by saying, "This is my marriage. You're my wife's sister. You need to stop." But she never argued like a villain. She argued like someone who had already decided she was right, answering with calm confidence, "I'm stopping you from lying to yourself, because you keep acting like if you just behave perfectly, she'll come back to you. And I've watched her pull away day by day like she's practicing for a life without you." I started catching myself waiting for the moments when my wife left the room, which made me feel disgusting and trapped at the same time, because wanting a conversation isn't the same as wanting an affair, but it's close enough that your conscience doesn't care about the difference. The line shifted again late one night when my wife went to bed early without even inviting me to follow, leaving the kind of silence that makes you hear your own thoughts too clearly, and I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, pretending to work while I replayed every cold interaction of the last few months like I was looking for the exact moment things died. Her sister appeared with 2 mugs of tea like she'd rehearsed it, setting one down in front of me and sitting across in a way that wasn't casual, because she leaned forward as if she was sharing a secret and said, "You're doing that thing again where you're punishing yourself for wanting her." And I told her she was reading too much into it, that I was just tired. But she didn't move back. She just softened her voice and said, "I know what it looks like when someone is starving and trying to pretend they're not hungry." The way she said hungry made my throat tighten, because it wasn't crude and it wasn't explicit, but it carried enough implication that my mind did the rest. And when I stood up to end the conversation, she stood too, mirroring me so quickly it felt like a trap snapping shut. She stepped into my space, not touching me at first, just close enough that I could feel her breath when she spoke, and she said, "I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do. I'm asking you to admit that being rejected over and over is changing you, because it's making you smaller, and I don't think you realize you're disappearing." I told her, "This can't happen, even as a conversation, because it's wrong and it will ruin everything. And she answered with a steady look that made me feel like I was the one being examined. Everything is already ruined. You're just the last one willing to say it out loud. My hands were on the back of the chair, gripping wood hard enough to hurt, and she reached for my fingers like she was calming a frightened animal, sliding her touch over my knuckles in a slow, careful way that sent a shock through me I couldn't hide. I pulled my hand back, too fast, and she didn't chase it, which was almost worse, because she just let the distance hang there and said, "See? You're not even allowed to be touched without apologizing for it." For a long moment we stood in that kitchen light, the house quiet upstairs, her expression half compassion and half something sharper, and I felt the pull of it like gravity, the ugly, seductive idea that maybe someone choosing me could make the rejection stop echoing in my head. I didn't kiss her. I didn't cross that last boundary. But when she turned to leave, she paused at the doorway and said, "I'm not going to push you, but I'm also not going to pretend I didn't mean what I said." And when she walked away, I realized my heart was racing like I'd done something irreversible, because even restraint can be a kind of surrender when it proves how badly you wanted to fail. I started noticing the small things first, the kinds of details you can dismiss individually, but together form a pattern that keeps you awake at night. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it no matter how badly I wanted to believe I was just being paranoid because of guilt. My wife began guarding her phone like it contained state secrets, flipping it face down whenever I walked into the room and taking it with her even to the bathroom. And when I asked casually who she had been texting so late, she would sigh as if I had insulted her intelligence and say, "Why does everything have to be an interrogation with you lately? Can't I just have a conversation without it turning into suspicion?" I tried to laugh it off and tell her I was only curious, that it had nothing to do with distrust, but the truth was I had begun feeling like an outsider in my own marriage, like I was the last to be informed about changes that directly affected my life. She started staying late at work more often, claiming projects had piled up, or that her boss needed her to review something urgent, and every time I suggested picking her up to save her the drive, she declined with a tight smile and said, "I need the quiet time to decompress. It's nothing personal." Everything was nothing personal, which somehow made it feel even more personal. At the same time, her sister kept inserting herself into my emotional blind spots with a precision that now makes my stomach turn when I think about it, because she would catch me staring at the clock waiting for my wife to come home and say softly, "You shouldn't have to count minutes in your own relationship." And she would sit beside me on the couch close enough that our shoulders brushed, letting the contact linger without comment. She began telling me stories about her own failed relationship, how she had felt invisible and unwanted, and she would look at me while saying, "The worst part wasn't that he stopped touching me. It was that he stopped seeing me." And the way she emphasized seeing felt like a direct challenge. I kept telling her that she was projecting, that every couple goes through phases, that I was committed to fixing what was broken. But she would respond with unsettling calm, "You can't fix something if you're the only one trying, and I don't think you've accepted that yet." The more my wife pulled away, the more her sister stepped forward, and I began to feel like I was standing between two mirrors reflecting completely different versions of my worth. One evening, I finally tried to confront my wife directly, not about the intimacy or even about her sister, but about the distance that had turned our home into a waiting room. I told her, "I feel like I'm losing you and I don't even know what I'm losing you to." And instead of reassurance, I got irritation. She crossed her arms and said, "You're overthinking everything because you're not getting your way physically, and now you're inventing problems to justify being frustrated." That accusation hit harder than I expected, because it reduced months of confusion and hurt into something selfish and shallow. And when I tried to explain that it wasn't just about sex, but about connection, she shook her head and said, "Maybe if you stopped obsessing over what's missing, you'd appreciate what's still here." I stood there feeling like I had somehow become the villain in a story I didn't recognize, and as she walked away with her phone already in her hand, I felt a cold certainty settling in my chest that this wasn't just stress or a rough patch. Later that night, as I sat alone again, her sister joined me without asking, and she didn't even pretend she didn't know we had argued. She looked at my face and said quietly, "She made you feel unreasonable again, didn't she?" and I snapped that it wasn't her place to comment. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned closer and said, "You keep thinking if you explain yourself better, she'll finally hear you. But she's already decided you're the problem, and that's a dangerous place to stand." There was something in her tone that felt less sympathetic and more observant, like she was studying the way cracks formed in glass. When she reached out and brushed her fingers along my arm, it wasn't overtly seductive, but it was deliberate, and my body reacted before my conscience could catch up. I pulled away, telling her this had to stop, that whatever was happening was wrong, and she looked at me with a softness that almost broke me and said, "I'm not trying to steal you. I'm trying to remind you that you're still someone worth wanting." That sentence echoed in my head long after she left the room, because it was the exact reassurance I hadn't received from my own wife in months. The tension in the house became something tangible, like humidity before a storm, and I started to wonder if my marriage had been over long before I was brave enough to admit it. I would lie awake listening to the quiet, thinking about how easy it had become for my wife to turn away from me, and how effortlessly her sister filled the silence she left behind. I told myself I was still in control, that noticing the cracks meant I could still repair them. But deep down, I knew something more complicated was unfolding, something that felt less like temptation and more like being slowly maneuvered into a position I didn't fully understand yet. I just didn't know how deliberate it all was, or how carefully the stage had already been set. The night it finally happened did not feel dramatic or cinematic. It felt exhausted and raw, like something that had been circling for weeks, finally lost the strength to keep pretending it would never land. My wife and I had just finished another argument that began as a conversation about schedules and somehow ended with her telling me that I was suffocating her with my constant need for reassurance. She stood in the doorway of our bedroom with her arms folded and said, "I cannot keep defending myself against your insecurity every single week. It's draining, and it makes me not want to come home." And I remember feeling the floor drop beneath me because I had spent months trying to approach everything gently, carefully, respectfully. I told her, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking you to meet me halfway because I feel like I'm standing alone in this marriage." And she responded with a flat, exhausted look and said, "Maybe you need to figure out why nothing is ever enough for you." Then she closed the bedroom door, not slammed but firmly, which somehow felt worse because it was controlled. I stood in the hallway staring at that door for a long time, replaying every word, wondering how wanting closeness had turned me into the unreasonable one. That was when her sister stepped out of the guest room like she had been waiting for silence to fall. She didn't ask what happened because she didn't need to. She just looked at my face and said, "She pushed you away again, didn't she?" And there was no sympathy in her voice this time, only certainty. I told her it was none of her business and tried to walk past, but she followed me into the kitchen, her footsteps quiet but intentional. She said, "You keep letting her rewrite the story so you're the needy one, but I've watched you bend yourself into knots trying to make her happy, and I don't think she even notices anymore." I leaned against the counter, too tired to argue, and admitted in a low voice that I didn't recognize us anymore. She moved closer slowly, as if approaching something fragile, and said, "You don't have to feel ashamed for wanting to be wanted." When she touched me this time, it wasn't accidental or fleeting. It was deliberate and steady, her hand resting on my chest as if measuring the rhythm of my heartbeat. I should have stepped back immediately, but I didn't, because my anger at my wife was still fresh and my pride was still wounded, and her touch felt like acknowledgement instead of rejection. She looked up at me and said quietly, "I'm not doing this to hurt her. I'm doing this because I can see what this is doing to you." And that justification slid into the cracks of my self-control with dangerous ease. I told her this was wrong, that it would destroy everything, and she answered without hesitation, "Everything is already breaking. You're just pretending it's still intact." There was a pause that felt suspended in air, the kind where you know a line is about to be crossed and you still have time to stop it, and instead of stepping away, I let my hand settle at her waist. The kiss was not wild or aggressive. It was hesitant at first, charged with all the weeks of tension we had pretended not to notice. And the moment our restraint dissolved, it felt less like passion and more like surrender. I could feel the heat of her skin, the way she leaned into me without doubt, and it sent a surge of validation through me that I hadn't realized I was starving for. We didn't speak while it happened because words would have forced us to acknowledge what we were doing, and for those few minutes I allowed myself to believe I was choosing something instead of being chosen last. When it was over, reality rushed back in with brutal clarity, and I stepped away as if burned, running a hand through my hair and saying, "We can't do this. This cannot happen again." I expected tears or panic from her, some sign that she understood the gravity of it, but instead she looked almost composed, smoothing her shirt and saying softly, "Sometimes people take what they've been denied for too long, and that doesn't automatically make them monsters." Her calmness unsettled me more than any accusation could have, because it suggested this was not impulsive chaos for her, but something she had considered carefully. I told her I felt sick, that I had just betrayed my wife in the worst possible way, and she stepped closer once more, brushing her fingers along my arm in a way that was almost soothing, and said, "You were betrayed long before tonight. You just didn't want to admit it." That sentence echoed in my mind as I retreated downstairs, unable to face the closed bedroom door or the quiet house that suddenly felt full of secrets. I sat alone in the dark again, but this time the loneliness was layered with guilt and something darker, because part of me knew that what had happened was not just weakness, but a shift in power I didn't yet understand. I told myself it was a mistake born from hurt, and that I would fix it, confess if I had to, end it before it grew. But as I replayed the steadiness in her eyes afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into something far more deliberate than a moment of anger. The guilt should have been enough to stop everything, but guilt is a strange thing because it doesn't just make you feel dirty, it also makes you hyper-aware, and once I crossed that line I started seeing details I might have ignored before. I avoided being alone with her sister for a few days, keeping conversations short and neutral, acting as though nothing had happened. But the air in the house had changed in a way that couldn't be reversed. She didn't chase me or pressure me, which somehow made it worse because she moved through the rooms with the same calm composure as before, laughing with my wife in the kitchen, helping with dinner, sitting at the table like the perfect temporary guest. If she felt any anxiety about what we had done, she hid it flawlessly. What unsettled me more were the moments between the two of them that felt slightly off, like rehearsed lines in a play I hadn't been given the script for. I would walk into a room and their conversation would stop half a second too late, followed by a shared look that lasted just long enough to make my stomach tighten. At first, I told myself it was paranoia born from my own betrayal, that of course I would interpret everything as suspicious because I had something to hide. But then I started noticing how often my name slipped into their whispers, how they would lower their voices when I entered and then resume at full volume once I left, as if the performance only required one audience at a time. One afternoon I came home earlier than usual because a meeting had been canceled, and as I stepped into the hallway I heard laughter from the living room, light and sharp, the kind that usually comes from a shared joke at someone else's expense. I paused without meaning to, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because I heard my name woven into the laughter. My wife's voice came first, saying, "He really thinks everything is about connection and communication," followed by her sister's softer tone replying, "He's predictable when he's feeling rejected." The words hit me like a cold splash of water, and I stood there frozen, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I had misheard or misunderstood the context. Then there was a pause, and my wife said something I couldn't fully catch except for the phrase, "Let's see how far he goes." And they both laughed again, quieter this time, like they were sharing something private and clever. My chest tightened so hard it felt difficult to breathe, because that sentence did not sound like concern or sympathy. It sounded like anticipation. I stepped back before they could notice me, and deliberately made noise with my keys, giving them time to rearrange whatever expressions they were wearing. When I walked into the room, both of them looked perfectly normal. my wife smiling in that familiar way that once felt warm and now felt staged, her sister glancing at me with a softness that carried a trace of something sharper underneath. Dinner that night felt like sitting at a table where everyone else knew the punchline except me. My wife asked about my day with polite interest, and her sister chimed in occasionally with supportive comments, but beneath the surface there was an undercurrent I couldn't shake. Every time I spoke, I felt evaluated rather than heard. Every time I moved, I wondered if they were watching for something specific. The kiss replayed in my mind not just as a mistake, but as a variable in an equation I didn't understand. Later, when I was alone in the kitchen washing dishes, her sister approached again, her tone casual, almost playful. She said, "You've been distant since the other night, and I hope you're not carrying all that guilt alone." And the way she phrased it made my skin crawl, because it sounded less like concern and more like confirmation. I told her quietly that what happened was a mistake and that it could never happen again, and she held my gaze steadily before responding, "You're allowed to want something, you know, even if she pretends that makes you weak." The words were familiar, rehearsed almost, and suddenly I wondered how many times she had practiced them before saying them to me. That was the moment suspicion shifted from vague discomfort to something solid and cold. It wasn't just that I felt watched, it was that I felt studied. The whispers, the shared glances, the overheard laughter. It all began to form a pattern that felt intentional rather than accidental. I went to bed that night beside my wife, listening to her steady breathing, and realized I no longer felt like the worst person in the house. I felt like the only one who didn't know the full story, and that realization frightened me more than the betrayal itself. I found out by accident, which somehow made it worse, because there was no dramatic confrontation or locked phone I had to hack into, just a careless oversight that shattered whatever illusions I still had left. My wife had left her tablet on the kitchen counter that morning, and I only picked it up because it kept lighting up with notifications while I was trying to drink my coffee in peace. I wasn't even looking for anything specific. I just wanted to silence the screen, but when I tapped it, a messaging app opened automatically, and the preview at the top showed my name in a thread between her and her sister. I should have put it down immediately. I should have respected the boundary that I had already violated once before. But something in my chest tightened with that same cold suspicion I'd been carrying for days, and instead of walking away, I scrolled. The first few messages were harmless enough, complaining about work and groceries and the usual daily noise, but then the tone shifted in a way that made my hands start to shake. My wife had written, "He's getting restless again," and her sister replied, "That's good. It means he's feeling the pressure." I felt my pulse in my ears as I kept reading, each line peeling back another layer of the lie I'd been living inside. My wife had written weeks ago, "If he crosses the line, I need proof, because I'm not going to walk away empty-handed." And her sister responded, "Leave that to me. He's predictable when he feels unwanted." The words I had overheard suddenly snapped into focus, no longer vague fragments but pieces of a deliberate strategy. I kept scrolling, my stomach turning with every message. There were references to timing, to creating distance, to letting him think it's his idea, and then a message from her sister that made the room feel like it was spinning. She had written, "I'll push just enough, but not too fast. He needs to believe he's choosing it." That sentence replayed in my head like an echo in an empty hall. The rejection, the hallway whisper, the careful touches, the patient encouragement. It hadn't been spontaneous temptation born from shared loneliness. It had been a test. Worse than a test, it had been bait. My wife had written at one point, "If he takes it, that's all I need," followed by, "I'm not being the villain in this divorce." Divorce. The word sat there in black and white, dated weeks before our last argument, weeks before the kiss, weeks before I even realized how deep the cracks had grown. They had already been planning an exit, and I had been maneuvered into becoming the reason for it. There were even discussions about financial arrangements, about documenting behavior, about ensuring a clear narrative if things went to court. I realized then that my guilt had been their leverage, that my weakness had been anticipated long before I stumbled into it. I set the tablet down carefully, as if it were something fragile that might explode if handled too roughly, and I just stood there in the kitchen trying to process the humiliation flooding through me. It wasn't just that I had cheated, it was that I had been guided into it, nudged and observed like a lab experiment. Every time her sister had told me I deserved to be wanted, every time she had framed my frustration as justified, it had been part of a script. Even her calmness after the kiss made sense now, because she hadn't been surprised. She had been successful. When my wife came downstairs later that morning, she greeted me with her usual neutral tone, asking if I had any plans for the afternoon, and I looked at her differently for the first time in our entire marriage. I saw calculation behind the calm, strategy behind the distance. She studied my face for a moment and asked, "You seem quiet. Is everything okay?" And I forced myself to nod, forcing my voice to stay steady as I replied, "Just thinking about work." Her sister entered a few minutes later, meeting my eyes briefly, and there was a flicker there that I hadn't recognized before, not desire or guilt, but evaluation. I felt something inside me settle into place, not anger exactly, but clarity. They had expected me to explode, to confess, to unravel under the weight of shame, but instead I felt an unexpected calm spreading through my chest. The humiliation still burned, but it was no longer blinding. It was sharpening. If they wanted proof, if they wanted a narrative, then they were going to get one, just not the one they had written. For the first time since this began, I understood the game I had been pulled into, and I realized that the only way out was not through confession or confrontation, but through patience. The strangest part about discovering you've been set up is how quickly the rage cools into something colder and more useful, because once the shock settled, I realized anger was exactly what they expected from me. They were waiting for tears, for shouting, for a guilty confession that would confirm the story they had already drafted in their private messages. So instead of confronting them with the tablet in my hand, instead of demanding answers, I chose silence. That morning I made breakfast like I always did, asked my wife if she needed anything from the store, and even apologized for being distant lately. I watched her carefully when I said, "I know I've been insecure, and I'm sorry if I've made things harder." And I saw something flicker across her face that looked almost like relief. Her sister, standing by the sink, avoided eye contact, but I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed, like a test had been passed. Over the next few days, I leaned into the role they had designed for me. I became reflective, remorseful, overly eager to fix what I had supposedly strained. I initiated calm conversations about communication, admitted I needed to work on myself, and thanked my wife for being patient with me. It felt humiliating at first, playing the part of the flawed husband, but humiliation is easier to swallow when you know it's temporary. I could see them recalibrating in subtle ways, the way their whispers grew less cautious, the way my wife started asking pointed questions about how I felt about loyalty and trust, almost as if she were gathering statements she could use later. I answered carefully, giving them nothing explosive, nothing concrete, just enough vulnerability to keep them confident. Behind that performance, I started preparing. I took a day off work under the pretense of handling a personal errand and met with a lawyer recommended by a colleague, someone discreet and methodical. Sitting in that quiet office, I laid out the situation without embellishment, explaining the emotional distance, the financial shifts I had begun to notice, and finally the messages I had seen on the tablet. The lawyer listened without judgment and then asked me questions that reframed everything in practical terms. He asked about joint accounts, about property titles, about recent transfers or unusual withdrawals. That was when I realized I had been so focused on the emotional betrayal that I hadn't fully examined the financial landscape. Over the next week, I began reviewing our accounts with a clarity I hadn't applied before. There were transfers to a separate savings account I hadn't recognized, small at first, then gradually larger. Nothing illegal on the surface, just strategic. I quietly downloaded statements, documented dates, saved screenshots of everything I could access legally. I even requested copies of our mortgage agreement and reread it carefully, noticing clauses I had ignored years ago when everything felt secure. I made no accusations at home, no sudden changes in behavior that might alert them. If anything, I became more agreeable, more compliant, which only seemed to reinforce whatever narrative they were building. Her sister continued her careful proximity, occasionally brushing against me in passing, once even murmuring, "You seem calmer lately, like you've accepted things," and I forced a small, almost ashamed smile as I replied, "I'm trying to be better." The irony almost made me laugh, because I was better, just not in the way she meant. I was thinking clearly for the first time in months. I noticed how often they spoke behind closed doors now, how sometimes they would both glance at me with an unreadable expression before quickly looking away. They believed they were ahead of me, that I was still stumbling through guilt and confusion. What they didn't know was that I had already secured copies of the messages from that tablet, forwarding screenshots to a private account and backing them up. They didn't know I had opened a separate bank account of my own, or that I had begun rerouting my direct deposit in small, legally permissible increments. They didn't know that the lawyer had advised me not to confront them until everything was documented and secure. Every evening I would sit at the dinner table listening to their casual conversation, nodding at the right moments, while mentally mapping out timelines and contingencies. It wasn't about revenge in the explosive sense anymore. It was about control. They had tried to corner me into being the reckless one, the unfaithful husband who gave them grounds for a clean exit with assets intact. Instead, I was becoming deliberate. I stopped reacting emotionally to my wife's coldness. I stopped seeking reassurance from her sister. I observed. I recorded. I waited. And the more I watched them move with quiet confidence, the more certain I became that they had underestimated me completely. I thought I understood the game once I saw those messages on the tablet, but what I didn't realize was that I had only uncovered the surface layer, and the deeper I dug, the more deliberate and rehearsed everything began to look. It started with a name I didn't recognize buried in an old message thread between the two of them. A man mentioned casually in passing by her sister with the line, "He folded even faster than this one." At first I assumed it was about her ex, the boyfriend she claimed had broken her heart, but something about the phrasing felt clinical rather than emotional, like she was describing a case study instead of a relationship. That sentence stuck in my head long enough that I did something I normally wouldn't have done. I searched her name online along with keywords tied to that first name, not expecting much but driven by a growing instinct that this wasn't her first carefully staged performance. What I found wasn't dramatic or headline-worthy, but it was enough. There was a public court filing from 2 years ago in another county involving her and a former partner, a messy breakup that included allegations of infidelity used during a property dispute. The details were limited, but the pattern felt painfully familiar. She had moved in quickly after his previous relationship ended. The dispute centered around shared assets, and according to the timeline, proof of his unfaithfulness surfaced conveniently during mediation. I couldn't see private evidence, but the parallels were impossible to ignore. The more I cross-referenced dates and details with what I had read in their messages, the clearer it became that her breakup before moving into our house might not have been the heartbreak story I had been fed. When I revisited the screenshots I had saved, I noticed things I had overlooked in my initial shock. My wife had written weeks before the kiss, "If this works, it solves everything." And her sister responded, "It always does when you apply pressure slowly." Always. Not this time, not hopefully, but always. That word hollowed something out inside me. This wasn't just about my marriage deteriorating or two sisters bonding over shared grievances. This was a coordinated strategy built on precedent. I began to see my role more clearly, not as a flawed husband who stumbled into temptation, but as a variable in a repeatable formula. The financial picture sharpened too. I discovered that the separate account my wife had been transferring money into was opened shortly after her sister moved in, and while the amounts were small enough to avoid immediate alarm, the consistency suggested planning rather than impulse. I pulled statements going back further and realized she had consulted a financial advisor months before intimacy between us began to collapse. That meant the emotional withdrawal, the rejection, the narrative about me being needy and insecure, it all started after she had already begun laying groundwork. I wasn't reacting to a failing marriage. I was reacting to a controlled environment designed to make me destabilize. The most unsettling realization came when I replayed every private conversation her sister had initiated with me. The phrases she used, the way she validated my frustration while subtly reframing it as justification, it all sounded less like spontaneous empathy and more like conditioning. She had never escalated too quickly, never pushed beyond what I could plausibly rationalize. Even the first physical moment between us had followed a major argument, ensuring my emotional defenses were lowered. I started to understand that they hadn't just anticipated my weakness, they had engineered the conditions for it. I didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, I dug deeper. I requested copies of public records related to that previous case involving her sister, enough to confirm the timeline and allegations without crossing legal lines. I documented everything meticulously, from financial transfers to message timestamps to changes in behavior that aligned too perfectly with their private strategy. The lawyer I had consulted reviewed the material and leaned back in his chair with a measured expression before saying, "This isn't just marital breakdown, this looks coordinated." Hearing someone else articulate it stripped away the last shred of self-doubt I had been clinging to. At home, nothing changed on the surface. My wife continued her measured distance, occasionally testing me with questions about trust and loyalty, and her sister maintained that carefully balanced proximity, no longer overtly seductive but still quietly present. If anything, they seemed more relaxed now, as though they believed the most difficult part was over. I watched them move through the house with shared confidence, and for the first time since this began, I didn't feel confused or ashamed. I felt focused. They thought they were guiding a predictable outcome, that I would eventually collapse into anger or confession, giving them the leverage they needed. What they didn't realize was that the more I uncovered, the less reactive I became. I wasn't the experiment anymore. I was collecting evidence of the experiment itself, and once I had enough, I knew exactly how I was going to use it. I chose a Tuesday night because nothing dramatic ever happens on a Tuesday, and I wanted the contrast between the ordinary and what was coming to feel almost surreal. I cooked dinner myself, something simple but deliberate, and told them I thought we should sit down together because I had been doing a lot of thinking about our marriage. My wife looked mildly cautious but not alarmed, and her sister gave me a small, encouraging smile like she believed I was finally about to confess everything they had been nudging me toward. We sat at the table, plates in front of us, the same table where I had spent weeks pretending to be lost while quietly rebuilding my footing. I began calmly, keeping my voice even as I said, "I know things have felt strained for a long time, and I know I haven't handled everything perfectly, but I've been reflecting on what's really been happening here." My wife folded her hands together and replied, "If this is another conversation about how distant I've been, we've already covered that." And there was that familiar undertone of controlled irritation. I shook my head slowly and said, "No, this isn't about distance anymore. This is about intent." That word made both of them still in a way that was almost imperceptible. But I saw it. I reached into the folder beside my chair and placed it gently on the table without drama. My wife glanced at it and asked, "What is that supposed to be?" And I met her eyes as I answered, "Documentation." I slid the first set of printed screenshots across the table, messages between them discussing pressure, predictability, and the need for proof. I didn't raise my voice or accuse them outright. I simply said, "I came across these by accident, and once I saw them, I started paying closer attention." Her sister's expression shifted first, not into panic but into calculation, as if she were assessing how much I actually knew. My wife tried to recover quickly, saying, "You had no right to go through private conversations." And I replied evenly, "You're right, I didn't. But what I found in them is a lot more serious than how I found them." I slid the next set of papers forward, bank statements highlighting transfers to the separate account, dates aligning with the emotional withdrawal that had blindsided me. I explained without emotion that I had consulted a lawyer, that I understood the financial timeline, and that I was aware of discussions about divorce that predated the so-called test of my loyalty. When I mentioned the word divorce, her sister's composure cracked just slightly, her hand tightening around her fork. I didn't stop there. I laid out the public court filing connected to her sister's previous relationship, careful not to exaggerate but clear enough to show the pattern. I said, I don't think this was spontaneous temptation or even a messy marriage falling apart. I think this was structured. The room felt smaller with every word, the air heavy with realization. My wife's face flushed as she said, You're twisting everything because you feel guilty. And I responded calmly, If I wanted to twist things, I would have confronted you weeks ago in anger. But instead, I gathered facts. Then I said the part that changed everything. I explained that the house deed contained a clause protecting the property due to my inheritance contribution, something they had either overlooked or assumed I didn't understand. I informed them that documented evidence of intentional manipulation could shift the narrative dramatically in court, especially if it appeared that I had been deliberately set up to create leverage. I wasn't threatening them. I wasn't shouting. I was simply outlining reality. I finished by saying, You expected me to explode or confess, but instead, I prepared. Silence settled over the table in a way that felt almost physical. Her sister looked at my wife, not with solidarity, but with something closer to blame. My wife stared at the documents as if willing them to rearrange themselves into something harmless. Finally, she said, So what do you want? And for the first time in months, I felt steady when I answered, I want this to end honestly, not strategically. There were no raised voices after that, no dramatic breakdowns, just the quiet collapse of a plan that had relied on me being too ashamed to fight back. I stood up from the table feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph exactly, but balance. They had underestimated my ability to think beyond emotion, and now the narrative they had carefully crafted was slipping out of their control. I left them there with the documents spread across the table, no longer the predictable man reacting to rejection, but someone who had finally stepped outside the trap. The house felt different after that dinner, not louder or quieter, but stripped of illusion, like someone had finally pulled back a curtain that had been hanging too long. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic ultimatums thrown across the room. Instead, there was a tense, controlled silence that stretched for days while lawyers began communicating in ways that were far more honest than we had been with each other in months. My wife avoided eye contact at first, moving through the house like a guest rather than a partner, and her sister packed slowly, deliberately, no longer hovering in doorways or offering sympathetic glances. The closeness that had once felt charged was gone completely, replaced by something colder and more transactional. The legal process unfolded exactly the way my lawyer had predicted. Once confronted with the documentation, the financial transfers were reframed not as innocent planning but as strategic preparation. The messages, carefully printed and dated, dismantled the narrative that I had been the sole reckless party. I did not deny what I had done, but I also did not allow it to be isolated from context. When discussions about property began, the clause in the deed became central, and for the first time I saw genuine frustration crack through my wife's composure. She had expected leverage, expected guilt to silence me, expected that I would be too embarrassed to expose the setup. Instead, the leverage shifted. Extended family inevitably became aware as proceedings advanced, and the story that had likely been drafted for them never materialized the way it was intended. I did not go out of my way to smear anyone, but when questions arose, I answered calmly and factually. There was no explosive confrontation at a family gathering, no public spectacle, just quiet corrections to assumptions that had already begun forming. I watched as the certainty in my wife's tone faded during those conversations, replaced by something more defensive. Her sister remained mostly silent, her earlier confidence replaced by a tight, measured politeness that suggested she had miscalculated the risk. The divorce itself was not quick, but it was far less catastrophic than it could have been. Assets were divided based on documentation rather than emotion. The house, protected by that overlooked clause and supported by clear financial records, remained mine. There was no dramatic courtroom speech, No last-minute confession. Just paperwork, signatures, and the slow dismantling of a life that had been hollowed out long before the legal end arrived. The sister moved out entirely, returning to whatever life she had paused to step into ours, and my wife found an apartment across town. When she left for the last time, carrying the final box to her car, she paused and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. It wasn't love or hatred. It was something closer to disbelief. After everything was finalized, the house was quiet in a way that felt honest, rather than oppressive. I walked through rooms that had once felt like stages for someone else's script and realized how much of myself I had been shrinking to maintain a version of stability that no longer existed. The guilt I had carried for that first betrayal didn't disappear overnight, but it changed shape. It was no longer the weight of being the only one who had failed. It became part of a larger, more complicated truth about manipulation, pride, and the slow erosion of trust. People have asked me whether it felt good, whether exposing the plan and protecting my assets felt like victory. The honest answer is that it felt steady. Not triumphant, not vengeful in some cinematic way, but balanced. I didn't lose everything. I didn't implode under shame. I didn't allow someone else to define the entire story of my marriage's collapse. The satisfaction came from regaining control over my own narrative, from refusing to play the role that had been designed for me. What surprised me most was the quiet that followed. I had spent months equating silence with rejection, with loneliness, with absence. Now, sitting alone in that same living room where whispers once stopped when I entered, the silence felt different. It wasn't the kind that excludes you. It was the kind that belongs to you. I realized I had been lonelier lying beside someone who had already decided to leave than I ever felt sleeping alone afterward. That was the final twist I hadn't anticipated. The revenge wasn't loud or destructive. It was simply the refusal to be cornered. And when everything settled, what remained wasn't bitterness. It was clarity.